In 2005, I predicted that in 20 years the EU will either collapse or become completely irrelevant as people will start noticing the treacherous garbage that the EU actually is. In 2005, I was laughed at. A little over 10 years since my prediction, there's less laughter and my prediction seems to be quite on track. Now, whether December 31st, 2025 will look how I predicted in 2005 or not, one thing is for sure. The EU will have to collapse, or change so drastically that will essentially be the equivalent of a collapse. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. The future of the European Union has never looked so bleak as it does now. When I predicted this over 10 years ago, I was called a radical extremist at best and a mentally unstable bigot at worst. Many of those people calling me names then ended up paying me to teach them how to work around the collapse-generating EU regulations. So, through the force of the unfettered capitalism of the black market, I ended up forgiving most of them. Anyway, joke aside, one of the patrons of this channel asked why I think the EU will collapse. That is to say, as opposed to why I want the EU to collapse, because that's a different topic altogether, which I'll probably approach after Britain's EU referendum. Well, in order for the EU to avoid collapse and succeed in its project to build the United States of Europe, it needs to succeed on 4 grounds: economic, social, political, and military. Well, it needs to succeed in others as well, but let's stick to these 4 for now. So, let's start with economics. The euro currency is a complete and utter failure. I mean, even hardline Europhiles are starting to grudgingly admit that you cannot avoid the rules of basic economics forever. You can try to bend some of them here and there for a while, but sooner or later economic justice must be achieved, and it always is. The euro currency is based on the fundamentally political belief that Italy, Germany, and Finland are about the same as countries and economic models. The only problem is that, you see, they are not. Germany is now benefiting from an artificially low-valued currency, whereas Italy and Greece and Spain and now France and Slovakia more recently struggle with an artificially high-valued currency. You see, contrary to the fairy tales of the EU architects, the Eurozone economies do not converge at all, but are more divergent than ever. And this trend will not change anytime soon, if ever. This reality comes from the fact that people, you see, are not equal, and as such, countries are not equal, and therefore their economies cannot be equal. No matter how much one would try to convince you otherwise, Germany will continue to have a more manufacturing-based economy, with trades being much more valued than in other parts of Europe, whereas Italy will continue to have a more service plus agriculture-based economy, with the trades being given less focus than in Germany. And you see, this is neither a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. They're different countries and work on different models on which to achieve prosperity. And one of the deeply buried secrets of switching to the euro is that it makes everything more expensive. This is something that every country that committed this mistake has indeed felt, though the government statistics avoid like plague to even address this question. But ask, for instance, any Greek what happened when the switch to euro occurred. Suddenly, the 50 euro bill could buy much less than 10,000 drachmas, which was about 30 euros. Similarly, the 50 euro bill still buys, even today, a lot less things than 60,000 Italian liras used to buy. Again, 60,000 Italian liras is around 30 euros. And this was true every single time in every single country that switched to euro. This means that in practice, the euro currency simply does make people poorer. and everyone knows it, whether they articulate it or not. More to the point, the ruthlessness of the EU standards have taken entire industries out from the market solely because Brussels said so. Now those who are bigger and smarter simply moved to Ukraine or Switzerland and now trade with the wider world the exact same products that the bureaucrats thought they are unfit for their little irrelevant club. Such an example is the classical light bulb. For instance, at no point in history did Ukraine manufacture so many light bulbs as it does today. And it's solely because of the EU's reckless and anti-market ban. And this is another economic failure of the EU that the citizens are noticing. The fact that the EU's economy has moved far away from a common market and dangerously close to a planned economy. And this downward spiral doesn't look like stopping anytime soon. As the saying goes, the more plans fail, the more planners plan. The only question is whether the international markets will be able to collapse the EU in 10 years, or will they need more time. But to think that the economics of the EU, especially the Eurozone, are sound is in itself evidence of magical thinking. In other words, the EU's economic failure is not a prediction, it's a certainty. You know, it's like the existence of solar flares. We know they exist and we know they happen once in a while, but we cannot predict exactly when the next one will occur. Same is true with the EU's economic collapse. We know it's coming, we know it's well deserved, and why will it occur, but it's a bit trickier to predict exactly when will it occur. For instance, in 1986, there were experts around the US Federal Reserve that predicted that the USSR will outpace the United States economically. So you see, the economic shakedown of the EU, just like the USSR's, is hard to predict in terms of giving an exact date. But nevertheless, the EU is experiencing constant fleeing of capital as investors get sick and tired of the nonsensical regulations, and the only countries that do get new investments tend to be those that simply ignore the EU regulations. And these realities will catch up eventually with people and thus deepen the realization that the EU has failed. And the EU has failed socially. On the social point, the EU is proposing nothing more and nothing less than the fostering of a new identity, the European identity. There is no Eurocrat who thinks otherwise. They don't want you to be Austrian, British, French, Romanian, Finnish, or Swede. No. They want you to be European. If you end up being a citizen of the world as a result of this process, that's even better. Now the problem is that this doesn't really work, not even on the young folks. And one of the reasons it doesn't work is because people have eyes and ears. They see that Krakow and Paris aren't the same, and that Lisbon and Helsinki may very well be different planets. People aren't stupid, you see? The European Union elites thought that if they spoon-fed internationalist propaganda to the youth and perhaps subsidized them to travel and study around the EU, they will suddenly feel more internationalist and European. Yet that doesn't seem to work. Every country in the EU that conducted polls regarding the approval of the EU has seen constant increases in the disapproval rate, even as time went on and old people died and the generations have changed. You know, this reality kind of tends to remind me of a friend of mine who was very happy to have qualified for an EU-subsidized scholarship to go study in the United Kingdom. You know, see, this friend of mine was completely convinced that I was nuts when I told him that he will regret this quite soon. Well, 4 months later after he left was back home as he dropped out of their stupid scholarship. The reason? Well, they tried to teach him that his dick is a social construct, and in his words, "My uncle didn't die in the revolution for me to be spoon-fed this kind of garbage. You know what? Fuck their scholarship and their Marxist nonsense." Good luck convincing that dude to ever trust the social project of the European Union again. You see, most people may have been, and indeed may still be, willing to share an identity and be European if that hadn't meant being a politically correct pansy. In other words, if the European identity had been given with values that were superior or similar to the values already held by the peoples of Europe, then maybe the project would have succeeded socially to a much larger extent than it did. The ongoing migrant crisis is bound to accelerate the social failure of the European Union because, you see, most people really do not believe in the same form of multiculturalism that the bureaucrats do. As the effect of these policies continue to hit the common man, the trust in this common space is bound to go even lower. Believe it or not, most people actually like that when they leave their home, most people they meet on the street speak the same language as them, hold the same fundamental values as them, and yes, look relatively similar to them. The main benefit of this union, the free movement of people, is also certain to disappear as fewer and fewer people are content with the Schengen Agreement as it stands now. You know, people actually like to have a border, believe it or not. Another gem, and this is another gem of wisdom the EU tried really hard to shun. As I said, most people are simply not stupid and understand that whereas I can be friends with my neighbor, we should still have fences between our properties. Same goes with countries. We can be friends with each other, trade with each other, or study in each other's countries, but that doesn't mean fences aren't necessary, and it also doesn't have to mean we are the same. I could go on with the social failure of the EU, but, I'll stop here. Let's get to the political failure. Well, for starters, the EU is not in any way representative. Most of its regulations, especially the very controversial ones, are not passed through the European Parliament, but as European Commission directives by a college of bureaucrats that are not elected and nobody can remove. If I want to, let's say, prevent a ban on larger washing machines in Romania, I know what to do. I need to convince 50,000 people to come out and protest. I also need to get some support from the largest manufacturer in the country. I can also raise 100,000 signatures for a legal challenge at the Constitutional Court. I can call the parliamentarian of my area, and if I convince another 300 people to do the same in their areas, with a bit of care, we can mount at least a staunch opposition in the parliament, if not a majority, to repeal the proposal. Now, thankfully, the Bucharest politicians, with all their stupidities and questionable characters, are not mentally challenged creeps with a god complex so big that they think they can tell me how I should wash my clothes. But the European commissioners are mentally challenged creeps with an infinite god complex. There actually is a ban on the pipeline that would make the washing machine in my home right now illegal because, you see, it consumes too much electricity. And that's bad. Now, if I want to stop such a ban in the EU, what are my options? Well, there's the European Citizens Initiative, which is as efficient as digging a 4 square meters hole in the ground using a spoon. I'll leave the links in the low bar, but essentially to get something repealed or passed through the European Citizens Initiative takes at least 2 years, most likely 3 or 4 years, and that's if you're lucky. Most initiatives are not that lucky, no matter how popular and sensible they may seem. For starters, the European Commission isn't mandated to follow through such an initiative. They're only mandated to publish a statement on their website in all official languages, of course, that they did in fact receive and acknowledge your initiative. That's it. Secondly, you need 1 million signatures from people living in at least 7 countries of the European Union. So if your initiative affects only 2 countries, tough luck. Thirdly, how do you address 1 million people from 7 countries? In what language? Appealing to what values? These are all serious questions. And mind you, this citizens' initiative thingy is rather new, implemented in 2012. Apparently, we should be impressed by this tremendous political progress. Now, you will excuse me for my failure to be impressed. Now, besides the European Citizens Initiative, there's also the option to organize in a cartel and make wacky protests in Brussels, like the French farmers do. But that's not political representation, that's bullying. Besides, why should the residents of Brussels be forced to put up with my protests? Maybe they do agree with regulating washing machines in their country. Why should my countrymen's opinion trump theirs? Or vice versa, for that matter. In addition to all of these, the purpose of a representative political institution is to take as many concerns as possible into account without descending into extremism. That's another aspect at which the EU has completely and utterly failed. There's political parties in the European Parliament that believe in the deportation of Jews or killing non-whites on the spot. And no, I am not joking. Well, I'm sorry, but, I will take the democracy of my country over the EU democracy any day of the week. At the very least, this country's democracy, with all its flaws, has prevented the resurgence of a communist party, and it's been 16 years since any extremist political party gained even one seat in the national parliament. Meanwhile, in the European Parliament, one communist of the Portuguese Communist Party was very close to imposing abortion as human right for 28 countries. It took 2 years of constant popular protests and genuine harassment of the members of the European Parliament to get the Estrela report rejected. To make things worse, every time such issues are on the table, you don't fight a private corporation with whom you can compete by gathering superior amounts of cash or whatnot. No. You are fighting against a massive collection of state agitators masquerading as NGOs funded with your tax money. How representative is to have your cash taken away from you at gunpoint and then funneled into radical feminist NGOs? In America, at least the states can vote, for instance, to cut Planned Parenthood's funding, but if they so desire, and many already did. But in Europe, there is no legal mechanism to stop the leak of taxpayers' money into the accounts of thousands upon thousands of agitprop NGOs that are busy promoting values that have nothing whatsoever to do with the desires of the common man. This model has indeed one precedent, the communist experience in Eastern Europe. I actually have a neighbor that worked as a state activist until 1989. That's what these EU-funded NGOs are, state activists. And the more people wake up to this reality, and they do, the more the political failure of the European Union will become evident. Now, there's 2 ways this can go down: either vote the EU out of existence or simply ignore it. The latter seems more possible to me, as we already have the experience with the EFTA. To quote the left-wing pro-EU senior editor at Euractiv, quote, "Buildings in Brussels continue to issue edicts and everybody else will continue to do what they do. You have to remember that there used to be the European Free Trade Association back in the 1950s and 60s. It still exists. There is still an office of the EFTA in Switzerland. In Europe, institutions are like museums. You can still visit them and they still function. So I don't see the collapse of the EU. I see its growing irrelevance to any of the issues that are at stake." Having said this leads me to the last point at which the EU has utterly failed: militarily. Now, failure is a bit too harsh. The EU barely even tried to succeed militarily. You see, a law is, for the most part, a political opinion supported by the barrel of a gun. That's all there is to it. Someone said that the EU could ban secession altogether and push everyone into ever closer integration. Well, they sure could do that, but how would they enforce it? The Soviet Union also banned secession, but they would send in tanks if you disagreed. Just ask Hungary and Czechoslovakia about that. Will Brussels tanks invade Britain? Would Brussels tanks invade Poland? Of course not, because from a military standpoint, the EU doesn't exist. From 1993, since the ECC transformed into the modern European Union, and until around 2009, the EU relied on the model of effectively bribing national politicians to abide by the EU elite's dictates. Now that model worked for a while, as it is the case with every model, no matter how stupid it is, but after so many failures and bailouts being paid, well, the money are running out. Also, up until recently, there was no public realization that this is indeed the case, whereas now this is an increasingly known fact, especially since Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, effectively said, "You know what? Fuck your EU money! Our border, our culture, and our national sovereignty is worth more than the worthless pieces of papers issued in Frankfurt by the European Central Bank." Now, of course, he didn't put it in these terms, but actions speak louder than words. The EU placed, for instance, sanctions and other toothless and meaningless measures meant to scare away the establishment in Budapest from doing what's right for their people. In the past, this scaremongering actually used to work. But now everyone suddenly realized that all the threats from Brussels don't actually mean anything, and that no, Hungarians are not obligated in any way, shape or form to give any flying toss about the opinions of some foreigner who barely knows where Hungary is on the map. Now, I know that there are attempts to create a EU army, but I suspect that will fail anyway, and even if it doesn't fail, it will probably be an army good enough to defend a city, and definitely not a continent. Moreover, for a good army, you need volunteers. Now, how many men would be keen to join under the EU flag to fight against dissident Hungarians? This is a serious question. If you haven't noticed, the harshest supporters of the European Union as it stands right now are very weak and old men and many women. Not really army material, isn't it? The only institution that can be counted as a force institution belonging to the European Union is Europol, but they have 912 employees, if I am to believe their website, and this 912 includes the secretaries, the boss, the janitor for their HQ in The Hague, and so on. So I ask again, the EU and what army can actually ban secession? The EU and what army can actually enforce their bureaucratic edicts if people start refusing to give a damn and simply ignore the EU's existence altogether? So, when all is said and done, the EU has completely and utterly failed on all major points that could have taken it to fulfilling its grandiose purpose. Just like its grandfather, the Soviet Union, the EU will collapse under its own weight. The only question now is, how will it collapse? Reformation, as far as I'm concerned, is already out of question. David Cameron tried and failed. Manuel Valls, the French Prime Minister, also tried to at least slow down this refugees welcome dementia. He failed as well. If giants like France and Britain can't even get minuscule reforms passed, what are the chances of the Netherlands, Portugal, Estonia or Hungary to get other common sense reforms passed? This is a serious question for those of you who believe that the EU can be reformed. Even if you do believe that some sort of a union is needed to maintain free trade or perhaps even to protect a common European identity, whatever that is, it is crystal clear that this European Union has failed at these goals in addition to failing at its own goals. The belief that the EU can be reformed from within may seem noble, but reality has already shown conclusively that it cannot be reformed and it will not be reformed. So, how will the EU fall? Well, there's three versions that I can see. One is the version I quoted earlier in this video, namely the EU will go down the path of a museum. Like many other European institutions, as the rest of Europe goes on with its life and the EU becomes yet another tiny, irrelevant footnote of history. The second scenario is through voting it out of existence, and this can happen in two ways. Either through repeated referenda in member states or through the emergence of EU's own version of Gorbachev, to simply put it out of its misery and admit failure. The third scenario, which I fear the most and indeed hope it won't happen, is via a civil war. Sadly, this third scenario is not so far-fetched as it seems. There are already paramilitary groups in Finland formed to curb the crime wave generated by the refugees. Sweden is also seeing a sharp increase of private militias who stopped giving a damn about the PC Swedish law and started to clean the streets themselves. Germany also has such groups as well. In France, the burning of refugee camps is now happening so often that it's no longer even news. In Eastern Europe, the traditional institutions are still holding up, to a certain extent. For instance, the government in Romania is still willing to back down in face of popular protests. The leftist Czech president has no qualm in opposing the bringing of culturally incompatible immigrants into his country. The Poles have elected a government that actually does what it promised, and of course, Orban, as usual, brings the middle finger to the table and refuses to back down or give a flying toss over what anyone else thinks about him. So maybe Eastern Europe can indeed lead the way to avoid a generalized bloodbath. Maybe. But if the plans for cultural enrichment continue, no amount of goodwill can avoid a sharp increase in violence in the streets of European cities. Again, I hope I will be proven wrong and the EU will fall relatively peacefully and more or less within the boundaries of the law. I really do. Anyway, I hope this answers the question, and I also hope the Brits will vote to get out of this coming June. That could be the starting point to a peaceful collapse. And with that being said, thank you for watching and supporting this channel. See you soon on Freedom Alternative.